Hello, welcome back to Torture Time in Android Studio. I'm your host, Dr. Guerreri, and this is my OnePlus. Today we're going to look at those few people brave enough to have submitted their attempts at playing with constraint layout and see how well they did. Let's check it out. Alright, first we got an attempt from Austin. Thank you for giving it a shot. Let's check it out. I'm going to save this. Take a look at it in the design editor. Oh, beautiful. Look at all these different things in there. Nice. Look how long that code is, by the way. Again, I really hate this the most about constraint layout, is that it makes it real long. It's very hard to find anything. All right, let's go with that and launch it and see how it looks on a device. The first build of the day. Might as well get it over with, right? Wait a while. If anybody else has a cool constraint layout creation they want to show off, now's your chance. Okay, looking good. Do we see any variations in space or anything? What's this guy coming up on the bottom there? Boy, let me try landscape mode. Not bad, not bad. They're a little bit cut off from the bottom of the screen in landscape mode, but overall everything remains. Trying to get landscape mode to work as well as the portrait mode using the same layout, usually not a goal that you want to have anyway. If you think about the apps that you use, very rarely are they going to have the same layout in landscape mode as portrait mode. They're going to generate a whole new layout. If you have the ability to rotate the screen, they're going to look completely different when the screen is put into landscape mode. So I wouldn't particularly worry about getting your stuff to look the same in landscape mode as it looks in not landscape mode, portrait mode. But otherwise, everything looking good here. Even amount of spacing. These buttons definitely seem to have the same amount on the right as on the left, but I think that's because they're the same number of letters. Easy and hard are the same number of letters, and we've used a mono font here. So I guess one way that we could trigger this to probably have a problem would be if one of them was longer than the others, if the text was longer. So it's harder. Then we see that, I'll run it again, it's not going to be quite as centered anymore. Harder. So it still looks pretty good. I mean, I don't know what the intent here would be artistically. I would argue this is probably the way to go, but medium is now no longer centered. Harder has pushed it over a little bit. But since Austin's springs here are well configured, the left and the right space is equivalent. So that's probably the most important thing in a constraint layout like this. All right, so that's good. I'm going to give this a shot maybe on a tablet some other day. We'll see if it looks better on a tablet too. But for now, this is cool. Let's look at how it was accomplished, the different constraints. So the top two are anchored all four ways. This one's anchored to the top left-hand side of the screen and then to this button on the right. This button on the right seems to be anchored also all four ways. Looks like almost every component here has all four ways to its anchor. Yep. And then they used units of even hundreds instead of the weird kind of 30s for the spring. So the only time there was a little bit of weirdness that had to come into play was the use of 70s for the left and right springiness of the center buttons. But again, as long as they're even, these two have the same springiness from the right and from the left, so that ended up balancing them out and centering everything, which is great. And then this one uses a manual 100 springiness from the top, which can run into some issues if the screen gets squished. These guys use 0 springiness from the top, so it's possible that this button doesn't end up quite where it's supposed to, depending on how narrow, how little vertical space you have at this screen. But this is going to work on the vast majority of displays. So always something to think about with constraint layout as you go further with your app. Make sure that you ask other people to try it out. It only takes a minute to try somebody else's layout out, so make sure you help each other out like that. I'm going to undo all this and go back to the thing I had before there. My basic view here. Let's see, I got one other entry. Let's try that one out too. From the absolute unit. This one's got a bunch of string resources that I don't have, so I'm just going to change them all to random letters. Good job putting content descriptions here. Not only is it a good idea to support the blind and mobility impaired, it is also the law in many places that you have to now. Your websites, apps, etc. Are legally obligated to support people with disabilities. So if you don't have those things like those alternative content descriptions and stuff, technically you can get sued for it, and some people do. Mostly trolls, but sometimes people who are actually disabled and are upset that they can't order pizza on your website because you've decided that your mechanism for ordering pizza is a giant picture of a pizza where people have to drag toppings onto it, which is not great if you're blind. Yeah, it's a real case. So, all right, this looks good. Grainy, but everything seems centered. The right side looks as centered as the left side. Everything looks good. The button looks centered too. All right, yeah, it's another good example. So a good constraint layout here too. Let's see how they pulled this one off. Let's just look at the design here. So this is constrained in 3 directions, so it's not constrained to the bottom. It just floats relative to the top, and the top gets some springiness on it, so that's a good idea. The star here is constrained to be above the big Android guy, which could run into some issues depending, again, on if you lack vertical space. It might end up getting squished, but it tries to get some spacing from the top and from the left. This takes multiples of 20, this takes multiples of 64. It can get confusing depending on how specific you want to be with everything. The centered button is the one that's anchored to all 4 directions. That's good. So this is anchored to the left and right hand sides and the top. Well, this is anchored to the left, right hand sides, and the bottom. So you have 2 major components that are anchored to the sides and the bottom. Sometimes I like to make sure that there's just one component that's anchored to the actual left, right, top, and bottom of the screen. That way, when you move that component spring, specifically, it moves all the components up and down with it. But obviously, if that's not the desired effect, if you want this guy to always stay where he is, no matter where you move the components down here, then this is probably the better approach, to have them anchored differently. And then these guys are properly anchored just to this guy, but then they're also anchored to the bottom, which is probably not necessary here unless you want specific spacing away from the bottom of the screen. Now, what you're probably most interested in this application is only how far away they are from this button, because this button already dictates how far it is from the bottom of the screen. So either make it so that only one of these buttons has spacing from the bottom, or only this button has spacing from the bottom. You don't need to constrain them both to the bottom of the screen, because otherwise they're kind of fighting. This one floats on its own to an extent. It's only anchored to this. It has to be below that array of buttons. So that's probably fine, but again, you could just have only one anchor to the bottom instead. But yeah, both of those submissions are good. Nice job, guys. Good use of constraint. Both line up symmetrically. Although for both of the submissions that you made, this one and the last one we looked at, I'd say those were both better served by linear layouts. They are blocky. They have like stuff in a row, basically. just content in a row, and there's no need for fancy layouts like Constraint with the two examples that we just saw. So I would stick with linear layout for the two that we just saw. And then I'm going to bring back what I had yesterday, my wrap content text box. All right, any other questions about constraint layouts and stuff before I move on? That's the kind of thing where you can learn it for weeks and still not master it. There's so much to it. There's also fancy things like the magnet tool. Where's that guy at? Somewhere. Magnet tool for snapping things. There we go, magnet guy. There's also things like you put in a button and you can click the magic wand, auto infer constraints, and it'll just try its best to put the thing where it belongs. And then when you move it, it'll keep trying to put it where it belongs. You'll notice that since it doesn't like negative constraints, it's like, nope, can't do that. So that can cause you some issues. You might want to clear them all, move it where you actually want to, magic wand it again. It'll come up with constraints. Sometimes you can do fine with just the magic wand and then get to a point where it's not working and just fix it manually. That can work for you too. You can set default margins so that you don't have to keep changing the stuff in the drop down. This is really convenient if you have a uniform spacing that you're going to be using, so make sure you play with the default margins if you're going to be using those drop downs in the constraint tool doodad thingy. And you can preview, obviously, in different modes. We looked at that already in the night mode with an action bar, with no action bar. There are many, 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 many tricks to editing the layouts here, but the biggest trick is to use linear layouts and go into code mode like a professional. Okay. So on to today's thing. First, we have this text here. Let me run this app again, and let's look at that text a little bit more closely. So when you have your apps, when you think about your apps, there's a few different kinds of text, right? There's a text that's just a display, like this, and then there's text that you could normally click into, and it would pop up my keyboard, and I'd be able to type in there. Let's say that I wanted this to be that kind of text. I wanted it to be the kind where you can type into. And then also, what do I do to make this button do stuff? So what do I do to make this button do stuff? All right. Well, if you click on the text and you look through all of the different attributes that are available to it, you probably find editable down here. Let's check that box and see what happens. Let's make this editable. Editable. Nothing happens. I forgot to show it. It's still not editable. Well, what the heck am I supposed to do then? Let's go back. It's added an extra warning to me. It now says, if I go to the warnings menu, using depreciated resource. Android editable is depreciated. Use an edit text to make it editable. Depreciated views, attributes, and so on are depreciated because there is a better way to do something. Do it that new way. You've been warned. Thanks, Android. Do it that new way. All right, what's an edit text? Do I have a component called edit text? Let's search. Edit. There's nothing called edit text. But if I type the words edit text, all of these appear. That's strange. Well, I guess somebody forgot to change the documentation, but all of these are what once used to be grouped under a single category of components called edit text. Edit text used to be all editable text box kind of things. So I'm going to go delete that is editable depreciated thing. In fact, I'm going to see what happens if I change this whole thing to edit text instead. What if I did that? It's changed the way it looks a little bit, and then it's given me some warnings, but it looks like I was successful there. Let's run it and try. That's an edit text now. What's it gonna do? I can type in there. Okay. La 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 la. I can now delete text. That's a little weird, right? That it keeps resizing. That's probably not what I want to see. What happens if I go over a line? Oh boy. That's not great. So not really the best kind of typing box. Let's try to make something a little bit more conventional. First, I'm going to delete the edit text that I have. I can either delete it here, or I could have gone into the code and wiped it out. I'm going to try one of these instead. Let's try the plain text one. I'm going to make sure that the button is under it so that it appears on the right. I'm going to go back and make sure that my weights are good. So I have the button at 0.3. I'm going to have this edit text at 0.7, so it's got a little more bias. You can set its default text. I'm going to set it to what I had before, the click me text helper. Click me text helper. You'll notice that it's cut off. It's cut off. So this is a one-line edit text. That's what plain text means. Let's run this and see what that looks like. You don't see a lot of these in apps, by the way, but you do see occasionally the kind of text box like this, where it only accommodates a single line, and when you go over, it just wraps around, and then to go back, you have to highlight it. These are usually like boxes for your username and stuff, where you don't expect people to go over. If you can think of another example in either chat of an app that does something like this, you can post it. But these are probably the less common kind of edit text, right? Let's see. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't have that displayed as I was running it. Womp womp. Okay, alright, so you can scroll over to the left and right with the magnifier. These are more common on iOS too, I think, by the way. I don't know if iPhone users want to confirm, but they have more of these one-line text boxes that don't go over to the next line, and you have to scroll left and right. The URL bar on the browser is like this on both systems, right? If you have a URL that's too long, you need to pan. So scroll left and right there. Okay, and let's say we don't want that functionality. Let's say that we want it to span multiple lines. Tons of ways that we can do this. Let's see a few different ones. I gotta look at my notes here because there's a lot of dumb ones. Okay, the first way that we can make it span multiple lines is to add this text multi-line option to the input type instead of person name. So I can have it be, rather than person name, text multi-line. Let's see what that ends up looking like. Check it out in design. It's now spaced across multiple lines there. This is going to bring us back to that same problem we had before, where it's going to like resize the UI as we type. So this isn't really an appropriate one for a setting like this, where you have other UI elements around it. You also notice it has some weird V-spacing at the top that we need to fix. So the one-liner is probably better than that at the moment. And let's see, what's the other one here? Alright, if you want to be really specific about what kind of text that your edit text accepts, you can actually specify all of the different digits or characters that you want it to take, like so. And so I've specified that it can take A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P in lowercase, it can take uppercase letters, numbers, and then the new line character and space. So this would be appropriate for like a username field or a password field. maybe this gives you some more granular control over the kinds of characters you're willing to accept. So if you want to reject special characters for some reason, this is probably going to be the way to go. So let's try that out again. Better, same issue, but now I can actually hit the Enter key to start new rows. Let me run it without that. Oh, whoops. Actually, I have a typo here. I was closing it too early. That's why the default text didn't appear. Run it without that. And we'll see that I can make, what do we want to make here? Some dollar signs, some exclamations, some questions. I'll make those things now. So it depends on what symbols you want to accept. Whoops, I didn't have it open again. You'll have to take my word for it. You can take dollar signs and exclamation marks and whatnot. So if you want to specify specific characters, you can do it like that. There are many input types available to you. How do you see all the different input types? They basically correspond to the ones that you see in the components when you go to add them here. So when you go to the different edit text options, there's plain text, which for some reason they call a person's name. There's password. Let's take a look at what the password one is going to look like. Again, I'll set that weight. Take a look at what the password one looks like by default. As you can expect, I get stars, right, instead of the password. And we get that same functionality where we have to use the magnifying glass to go left and right here. So we're going to stick with, let's go with password for now as we move on. Just note there are many different kinds of edit texts, many different things you can do to limit the characters in them, whether you want them to span multiple lines or not. You can change the way they resize, the amount of space. You can designate that they accommodate specifically amount of space and no more. Lots of different stuff you can do. If you have specific questions about how to make a text box look a particular way, let me know, and I will try my best to get your text box to look a certain way. So if you've got a text box that you can't wrangle into the dimensions that you want to wrangle it into, let me know, and I will try to show you how to wrangle it into those dimensions. For now, we're going to move on with the password. Notice there's nothing here that changed except the input type. Everything else is pretty much the same. It should be 0.7. And wrap contents in this case for the width means that it's going to try to fit the weight rather than the content inside of it. It still doesn't try to fit that string in there because it allows it to wrap around to the left or right and force you to scroll in order to reach it. So if that's the desired function, which it probably usually is, most edit texts you have for entries like your name and your password and stuff are like that, then you're probably going to use one of the ones like this. Alright, so let's ask a really simple question. We've done UI, we have a basic idea of how to drag components and stuff. So now a simple question, how the heck do I get a button to do something? Let's just say I want Hello World to print out when this button is clicked. I want to make a true Android Hello World actually does something. I want Hello World to print out when that button is clicked. You'd think it'd be easy, so let's have a look. Android button, do something on click. I think that's a pretty fair thing to search. First of all, 7 years old question, last active a year ago. How do you handle button clicks? There are at least 4 ways of doing it, briefly listed here. This was back 7 years ago. There are now more, but there's at least 4 ways of doing it. Have a member of View onClick Listener class in the activity and assign it to an instance that will handle onClick logic or onCreate. If that sounds like gobbledygook to you, then you're probably not the only one that sounds like gobbledygook to. Create onClick Listener in the onCreate method. Assign it to the button using onClick Listener. Implement onClick Listener in the activity itself and assign this as a listener. have a public method in the activity that implements onClick logic and assign it to the button in XML. 4 ways to do it. Let's see if I can show you all 4. I'm going to try to use the feedback from Stack Overflow. I think they have all of these listed here at some point. So the first one I'm going to do is the one that is the least often used, and the one that for some reason people usually tell you to avoid. It's actually rather hard to find it. If you check Android's official documentation for button, I think they don't even mention it anymore. So it'll tell you how to set an on-click listener here. I can switch between Kotlin and Java here if I want. I'm going to switch to Kotlin because that's what we're using. So it'll show you how to set an on-click listener here. It'll show you how to set it in a different way elsewhere. Here it only specifies one of those 4 ways to do it. But the very easiest way of all is the one that's described in this Stack Overflow post. It's been there since the very beginning, and it's also frowned upon because it sets it in a way that is not code specific, I guess you could say, or I'm not really 100% sure on what the big argument is for it. But the crux of the argument is that your UI code should be separate from your UI itself, from your XML. And so they don't like you doing this, but it's worked from the get-go. And that's, you specify another XML value for your button called onClick, and then you just write the name of the method that you want to invoke. So I don't know, I'll call it button click. For now, this is going to tell me an error because I don't have that method yet. So now we're finally going to get into our code. I'm going to open my main activity.kotlin file here. And I need to write a method named button click in order to get this to work. So it'll tell me I need public void button click. All right, let me write a public void button click. Public void button click. Kotlin is very much like Java. What's the problem? What did I do wrong here? How come my public void button click has been rejected? Let's see. What did I do wrong here? How come my public void button click is continuing to be rejected? What did I do? Why is Kotlin so confusing? What have I done incorrectly? Any hints? Well, they decided to change the name of the function, right? It's not public void, it's fun. Functions in Kotlin are fun rather than publics. All right, let's go back and look at this. All right, fun button click. Seems to work. How do I print things to console in Android? System.out.println is not going to work for you here. What you want to do is log. And log is a little bit different than println in that it takes 2 arguments. The first argument that it takes is a tag. You can use tags to group your messages in different ways. In Eclipse, we're used to only having 2 groups. We have system.out and system.error. If you still want to just put everything in out, you can just make a tag called out. But you can group things into tags like out, error, warn, info. You can make your own custom tag like basic output or something and group things that way. It's entirely up to you how you want to do your tags. You can make them different colors and other fancy stuff in the command line. All these wonderful things. All right, let's see if that works. Fun button click. Basic output. Hello world. Seems like that should work, right? Seems like that should work. Clicking it. Oh boy. That didn't work very well, did it? In fact, it crashed. How do I see why it crashed and what happened? Is it still open there somewhere? There we go. Click. Bye-bye. All right. So it crashed. How do I see why it crashed? Where is the console here? Is it terminal? No. Is it profiler? No. It's actually logcat is going to be your main console. But look, bunches of words, and none of them related to my application. And then I can't do anything with this drop down. And it's in verbose mode. Do I want to change verbose mode? Well, one thing I can search for is my tag. Basic input, nowhere to be found. So it doesn't look like I found my tag. Let me run this again, and we'll look at how you can filter your logcat messages to not be a swarm of craziness. So when you first start your app, you'll notice it'll change the logcat target here, this drop down, to your app. That's great because it's supposed to only show you messages from your app. In practice, it just shows you a bunch of garbage in addition to those. I mean, obviously, none of these are things that I printed in my app. So you can get rid of these to an extent by changing the kinds of messages you want to see, but every category of these messages has a bunch of crap in it too. So that's not going to happen for you. You can edit your filters to remove things, so you could just gradually add all this different stuff that you don't like to be removed. You can do quite a bit with logcat, change the output of the console in tremendous ways, but you're probably not going to want to do that. Probably all you want to do is see some frickin' debug statements, the easiest thing possible. So let's see what happens when I click my button there in logcat, what goes down. An error happened, so this should be pretty familiar to us coming from Eclipse. And how do we track down where that error occurred? Same thing that we should be used to from our Java development classes. We want to find the topmost message that occurs in our program. The bad news here is that there isn't one that occurs in our program, so there's no line to reference. Well, all right, then let's read this. Could not find button click view in a parent or ancestor context for Android. OnClick attribute defined in the button with ID button 3. Okay, so we couldn't find the method that it was looking for in the XML here. What you need to do, in addition to specifying the function name, is also take a view as an argument. I'll take a view called v as an argument, and view needs to be imported. View needs to be imported. So how do we import things in Android Studio? Anybody want to take a wild guess on how we import things in Android Studio? How do I import things? Where's my little tooltip suggester thing? This just tells me nothing. This tells me that I have a problem. How do I import things coming from other IDEs? Anyone have an idea? Alt, enter. Convert, specify type explicitly, put parameter on separate lines, enable a trailing comma. Alt, enter is like the fast hotkey thingy for different kinds of help options. In this case, the problem is actually that I've structured the arguments differently than Kotlin expects them. So you can take a view as an argument. Kotlin takes it like this. You got name, and then if you want to specify, you can specify the type. Sometimes you can omit the type. It depends. We'll look at some examples where you can do that. But anyway, let's run this and see if that's good enough now that we've specified the view. Clicky, 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 clicky. Hello world, look at that. Look at it come up a bunch of times as I type there, right? So I got the hello world to come up. Cool. So that's the easiest way, in my opinion, to get button input. So that's the discouraged approach because it keeps your XML and your UI code tied together. And we see that the, what do they call it? The tag comes in first and then the message. So you get the tag and then the message, and you can trim your output to only look for a specific tag, which is really helpful, or you could look for a specific message. So logcat is a lot stronger than the console that you're probably used to. Make sure you're taking advantage of it. Now, what is this view thing? What is that? In order to demonstrate, I'm going to make another button. This one's going to be match parent 2. I'm going to make this guy's weight 0.5. Each of these buttons is going to take half the remaining weight, 0.25. Then I'm going to go to the code, and I'm going to make sure that they have the same text. So I'll change the text to click me. And then I'm going to add that onClick method to the other button as well, so that they both follow that onClick method. And then I'll change the font size, since I did it for the other one too, just so they look identical. The easier way to make a new button there, by the way, would have just been to go into the code, copy this, paste it, and then just change its name. That would have been by far easier, right? So I'm showing you how to do things in baby mode because I think most people prefer it, but the more you do stuff in code, the more you'll realize it's usually faster. Okay, launching this again, we'll see that I'm going to be able to use both of those buttons to print hello world to the console. Oops, sorry. So I can hit that one, I can hit that one, they both print hello world. What if I want to distinguish what that method does based on which button it was that clicked it? That's where the view comes in. So the view that it takes as an argument is basically which button clicked me. So let's say I want to log some details about the button. Button details. Kotlin similar to Java. Let's see what I can do here. So I got view dot, what kind of stuff do I have? I got toString. I got background, clip, is clickable, is focused. What kind of stuff do I want? Maybe something about its text. Well, they're both the same. Maybe something about its ID. Let's go with ID. Well, can I print the ID? No, I can't. So what are my recommendations here? I can add toString. Pretty similar to Eclipse. One thing you might have noticed that's different is that you can either put or omit the semicolons. Semicolons are optional in Kotlin, so if you're just so used to it that you can't help but type them, it makes no difference. If you come from Python or JavaScript or something where you're more used to not typing them, well, more power to you, because now you don't have to. So let's see if this works. Let's see if I can print out the different buttons details when this runs. Alright, so that guy has an ID of 2130 whatever, and this guy has an ID of a different number. So you can see the two buttons are different. You can now distinctify which button was clicked. You could do something like compare the text to, or any number of different things. Normally you're going to be comparing the ID. So this is approach 1 to getting a button click. Approach number 1 to doing something on button click. Alright, approach 2. This is the preferred one. This is the one that comes from the Android official documentation. Let's go to the button documentation officially, and it's going to give you this code to set a listener. Let's look at the difference between the Kotlin and the Java version for a bit of an intro to Kotlin. Let me paste both in, and we'll see what the difference is. Yep. So that is the Java code here. Clipboard content seems to be Java code. Do you want to convert it to Kotlin? Yes. Did it work? No. Why didn't it work? Well, it didn't import button for me, so let me do that. Alt-Enter gives me the opportunity to import it. Imported android.widget.button. Lovely. And then what else? Well, it's looking for a button called button ID. Code here executes on the main thread. So, all right. Well, I don't have a button called button ID. I think I have one called button 3. Oops. Let's try to find button 3. All right, that seems good. But what happened here? Unresolved reference, activity named. I don't know what to call it. Activity main. What happened? Why did that decide to break? It's not even finding it anymore, is it? Well, just one of those things. Let's see. If I clean this project, maybe it'll work again. Cleaning, cleaning, cleaning. Cleaning, cleaning, cleaning. And no, it doesn't seem to have gotten any better. Let's go back and undo that stuff that I added and see what happened. Fine. After pasting, not fine. So fine. Not fine. Fine. Not fine. What did I do in order to break it? It looks like it was one of those imports, right? It looks like it was this Android.r import. What if I get rid of that one? Oh, then activity main works again. Okay, so that import broke the most basic hello world functionality in Android. And all I did was copy code from the official Google Docs. Woe betide me for copying code from the official Google Docs. All right, let's look for button 3, which is the button that I actually have. You don't need that R. The problem that happened here is basically a compatibility issue between Android X app compat activity and R. It was trying to import different versions of R. I've had this happen before. It's been frustrating. It's just one of those things I wanted to point out. Anyway, so I was able to convert this to Kotlin without actually using the Kotlin version, just by pasting it in. Let's see how similar this is to the Java one without converting it. So I'm going to paste it in and not convert it. And we'll see what the difference actually is. So no, I don't want to. All right, so in Java, you have the keyword final. You designate the type first, and then you designate the name of the variable. So button with a capital B, the type, and then button. In Kotlin, we use the keyword val. In Kotlin, you don't have to designate the type if you don't want to. So in many cases, you can omit this. But we're going to keep it because it is necessary in this case. We'll go into why. Probably won't go into why now. Maybe we'll go into why at some point. But anyway, the val keyword designates that something is not mutable. That's the same thing as basically being final in Java. That means that you don't expect that variable to change. So there are two main data types in Kotlin to consider. There's val, which you designate once and they don't change, not mutable. Those are finals. And then there's vars, which if you use the JavaScript, you'll be familiar with too. Vars are mutable. They can be changed. So if you have a button that you're going to be doing stuff with, the button that's going to be stored in that variable is probably going to be the same throughout the life of your program. You're just going to set it once. So that's going to be a val. Whereas if you have a string or something whose value is going to change throughout the program, you're going to modify it, that's probably going to be a var. The method call is pretty much the same, the find view by ID. If you hover over it and see the details, it's going to be pretty much what you're used to. Finds a view that was identified by the Android XML attribute that was processed in on create. So when it creates the activity, all these different elements that you registered here get registered to that what do they call it? r.id category, and you can access them from that point. And this ID that is at the top of every component is necessary to build any component, and this is going to be how you access your different components. So make sure that this is something that you remember. So this is going to be my password field, I'll call it. This guy is going to be the left button. This guy is going to be the right button. I'll call this guy the blue Android icon. And this guy I'll call the red Android icon. Okay, so now I can refer to them by those names instead. So this is going to be the left button that I'm trying to put a listener on. Okay. Continuing with the difference between the Java versions, this is where Kotlin, I guess, has its most shiny feature, is that you don't have to specify the on-click method here through fancy interpretation and lambdas and stuff. This kind of thing is usually able to be omitted in Kotlin, whereas in Java you had to specify the onClick listener there. So we created an anonymous class, and then we had to override one of its methods there. So pretty similar, and then also obviously the omission of the 2 semicolons. So pretty similar in this case. The Kotlin code is just slightly shorter. You'll notice that that's usually the case. The Kotlin code is very slightly shorter. All right, so all of this happened in the onCreate method, and now here I can write whatever I want to do. So let's say I have button click Alt, and this, I don't actually have to take a view as an argument here if I don't want to. I can just call button click Alt here. If I don't need a view, I don't have to have one, so I'll just basic output. Hello again, world. Let's see if both listeners can cooperate at the same time. Remember, I only registered the new guy to the left button. Only registered the new guy to the left button. So right button just prints the hello world with the ID. Left button prints the hello world with the ID, and then also hello world again from the other listeners. So you can have multiple listeners registered, but wait, the left button onClick method no longer works. It only prints the listener there. So one listener at a time, unfortunately, is all you can register. Point that out. So this onClick thing doesn't work anymore because I registered a new listener in the create method. So let me take a poll then and see which one you prefer. Which button code do you prefer? Listener, XML, onClick. Those are your 2 main options. Listener and XML onClick. I'll get a couple of other examples. Looks like most people prefer the XML onClick option. In that case, I'm just going to go over this one briefly, but maybe I'll demonstrate it if there's any interest. I don't usually use this one. So you can make the activity, and this is kind of closer to what we do in the swing examples that we do if you've ever taken a class with me and you've had to work with a Java swing. We can make the activity implement onClick listener. That's what swing does too. It makes the panel implement onClick listener, and then you register every button with this, with the class. So you'll see how they did that in the example here. Instead of setting the onClick listener to an anonymous class, they registered it to this. And then you have an overarching onClick method that captures all those different onClick events, and then you decide what to do with them using a switch statement to see which button has been pressed. So again, I'm just going to gloss over that possibility, but if you have a lot of buttons, this can end up being neater, just not usually the way I do it. Okay, I think that's enough for looking at how buttons work. Now let's do something useful with the buttons rather than just printing out some stuff. Let's try to move you to the other activity that we made earlier, that Constraints Playground one. Let's look at how you move between activities. And to do that, first let's talk about what activities are. You'll notice that both mainActivity.Kotlin and ConstraintsPlayground.Kotlin are called compat activity. They've extended app compat activity. The little fancy bar there is the Kotlin version of extension. So they've extended app compat activity instead of activity. Again, goes back to that support library and the different ways they branch out. So these are both activities. They're just activities that are also compatible with earlier versions of Android that don't necessarily support some of the features we use here. So Android does some funny hacks to make sure that those features show up. None of that is super important. An activity is basically a page of XML like this, and then the corresponding code that's attached to it. So every activity's life cycle is a little bit like this. It's going to run its onCreate method. It's going to make all of this XML and stuff. You see the onCreate method is created automatically on both of these. There are other methods like onCreate that you might be used to if you come from a background like game design or something. There are onDestroy, there's when it's paused, I don't remember the name of it, but when it goes into the background, and then when it resumes, so onResume. These are all functions that you can also call when an activity is brought back into the foreground, or when it goes to sleep, when it becomes a background activity. Do all those different kinds of things. But the onCreate method is basically its constructor. It runs when it's born. And then there's a main thread that runs from there. One of the quirks of Android, which is pretty much consistent to all UI systems, it's going to be familiar to you from Swing as well, is that Android will only update the UI on the main thread. That means if you want to change the text of a button or something from another thread, you can't. You have to ask the main thread to do it. It also means that everything that you put into this activity, unless you thread it, is all going to run on the same thread as the UI. That means if you do anything that's really resource intensive, you're also going to lag the UI. So any kind of long for loop that you got, or whatever it is that you do inside of your activities code, if it's too intensive, it's going to lag the user interface as well, and it might make your app unresponsive. And if your app becomes unresponsive, Android will kill it. So make sure that you don't do too much work on the UI thread, and at the same time, be aware that in order to make any kind of display stuff happen, you have to talk to the UI thread again. That'll be something we go into much later. All right, so moving from one activity to another requires you to make something called an intent. An intent is your intent, to move from one activity to another activity. So if you want to go from main activity to constraints playground.colon, we have to make an intent. Let's look up how to do that. Let's see what the Android documentation says. So Android, go to a new activity. Fix my typo. So I'm going to go into developer, Android blog. How to start a new activity. All right. So I've got my onCreate method here. The first step's to add an activity to the main class so that it's called when the send button is tapped. So called when the user taps the send button. I want to show this as another example of Android's hilarious inconsistency. They tell you not to do the onClick XML thing in various places, but then you look at this guide on how to use intents, and the first thing they tell you is to make this kind of function, then return to activity.main.xml, locate the onClick property, and then add the send message method to the onClick property. So they want you to use the onClick version here. They don't show you how to set up the button listener. Instead, they tell you to do the onClick variant. Okay. All right, so on to the building of the actual intent. Here they're going to show us how to make an intent and then send it to, and also send some information to another activity. So in order to send information to another activity that you're opening, you need to put it in what's called a bundle. You can put any kind of info into a bundle. You can put text or integers or objects or whatever. And everything that you put into the bundle has to be registered with a keyword, basically, a key. If you're familiar with hash maps or something, you have a key for each item, and then there's the value of the item, and we'll get that on the receiving end. So we'll see how to do that with text, then maybe we'll try it out with integers and stuff later. Let's look at the difference between the Java and the Kotlin code here. So Java, which should be familiar to you, we have to make a new intent, we have to make the new edit text reference and find it. We have to make a new string for the message, get the edit text as a string, and then we do some stuff with the intent. The Kotlin version, pretty similar, except for some reason the documentation decided to reorder the way that these things go in. So in the Java version, the edit text gets made second. In the Kotlin version, it gets made first. There's no particular reason why either of these need to happen. Also, in Kotlin, they decided, in order to kind of cheat and make it look like the Kotlin code is shorter, in Java they declared the intent separately and then did the intent.putExtra on another line. But in Kotlin, they made the intent and then did the apply and the putExtra on the same line just to make Kotlin look shorter. If they had done that in the Java version would be shorter. But of course, the Kotlin version needs to be shorter because that's the reason they switched to Kotlin in the first place. Anyway, that complaint aside, let's use the Kotlin version here and take a look at how it works. I'm going to put this in my button left click instead of printing that output. You see I got a lot of errors here. I need to import the edit text widget, so I hit Alt-Enter to do that. I need to find my edit text in particular. What did I call that thing again? Too many names here. Password something? Password field. Alright, again, I didn't have to do this on separate lines. I could have done edit text, and then I could have done .text.toString here on one line in order to retrieve its text that way. The cool thing about Kotlin is I didn't have to change the left-hand side here at all, right? Because I don't have to specify a type in Kotlin. So isn't that neat right there? I was able to get a string without having to change the left-hand side at all. So that's definitely a kind of cool feature of Kotlin if you don't like languages with really strict types. Neat. I'm going to need to import intent. Let's see which one it imports. Contents.intent. You notice everything else except for the original app.compat activity inherits from the root Android. Okay, inherits from the root Android. Let's see if there is a version of intent that comes from the Android X library. So, is there an Android X.content? No. Is there an Android X.intent? No. Is there an Android X.appcompat.intent? No. Is there an Android X.appcompat.content? Yep. Is there an Android X.appcontent.intent? No. So there's a... Is there an Android X.appcompat.app? .intent? No. Is there an Android X.appcompat? Anyway, enough of that. There's so many different levels to the hierarchy. It's hard to tell which one you need, but the base Android version is going to be fine for these. When you run into problems with this, you'll know it. Okay, here we need to specify the name of the activity that we're going to. Display message activity was the sample given. Ours is called Constraints Playground. Constraints Playground in the auto suggest there. And here we have to put the information that we were going to pass along. So this is going to be the message now rather than the edit text because I made it a one-line wonder. And what's this? What is extra message? What do we have to do with that? Let's see what recommendations it gives me. What did I import? Android.provider.alarmClock.extra message. That's not right. I don't need the alarm clock. This is actually just supposed to be a string that designates the tag or the key for your extra message. It's not supposed to be an import statement. I don't think the documentation specifies that. Again, they just kind of assume that you know it. They put it at the top here for some reason. But we're going to just hard code it as edit text, or let's say password info. So we're going to say that that text comes in password info, and we can actually put multiple extras in at the same time. So we can just say secret value, and this is going to be 5. So we can have many put extra statements, and these will ship multiple things to the activity that we're creating. So I'm shipping the password info from the edit text, as well as the secret value that is 5, to that new activity. Okay, let's run this first and see if I can actually open that new activity successfully. Alright, left button. Ta-da! I'm back at the Constraints Playground in all of its splendor. Lovely. Okay, so I was able to open it. Now I'm going to go back to my constraints library, and I'm going to add some text view here. It's going to have no text. I'm just going to make it blank. I'm going to use the constraints to center it relative to this guy. I'm going to have it wrap content in width and height, and then I'll just I can either anchor it to this guy, or I can anchor it to the sides. If I want it centered, it's easier for me to anchor it to the sides. Whoa, no, I intend to do that. Okay, so now I have it centered, and then I'll space them out a little bit away from that guy. Alright, so the goal here is going to be for me to display your password. I'm going to go to the code editor, and I'm going to give all of these buttons and stuff a name. So this guy, I'm going to change its name. You can also change the ID in the baby mode too. This guy is going to be top button. So we'll refactor everywhere that occurs. I don't think it occurs anywhere, but that's fine. This is mid left button. This is mid right button. This is bot left button. And this is bot right button. This is Android icon. And that blank text view is going to be password view. Okay, so I've given them all cleaner names. Let's go back to my constraints playground here and figure out how to retrieve the contents of my intent bundle and put them into that text view there. Let's see if I can do that. Oof. Okay, so I have the same import statements that it shows me. It's going to tell me that display message activity has an error, but it doesn't because I've already fixed it. It does recommend the same thing. Press Alt-Enter whenever you mess up or you have a bad import, and it'll automatically import it for you. So Alt-Enter is the attempt to fix it button in the Android Studio system. We've already created the second activity, that's why we don't have that error. We have created it in the proper way by saying new activity, which does all these things that they describe, where it creates the layout file, it adds an activity element to the manifest. If those things aren't done, you would get an error. Anytime you go to new activity in Android Studio, it does those things for you, makes sure you don't have a problem. It's going to want us to do some stuff with the text view and the new activity. We already did that. And now let's get to the part where we extract the information from the intent. And again, let's look at the difference between the Java and the Kotlin version and look at how hilariously Google decided to cheat once again for no reason. So once again, they decided that they were going to create a separate line for the intent and then call intent.getStringExtra to make it look like the Kotlin version is shorter, when all you have to do in order to match the Kotlin version is type getIntent.getStringExtra in the Java version. You could have just done this on one line instead of declaring it and then doing it separately. You'll notice this recurring trend where they try to make Kotlin look shorter because they made a commitment to it. Likewise, for the text view, they're going to declare it as a value. The Kotlin one does... Anyway, I don't know if you guys have the same problem. Hopefully it comes back here. That the Kotlin version, where it has the find by view ID, it finds a text view, and then .apply, is much more ambiguous to me than the original Java variant, which is to get the text view and then hit set text. To me, that's much more straightforward than Kotlin's weird little .apply and then having to update a field. There are probably technical advantages to the way Kotlin does it, but the Java version much more intuitive to me. Anyway, we're still writing in Kotlin here, so I'm going to pick this up and see what I can do with it. I guess I'll do a poll. Cool. Which one is clearer to you? Java's set text, Kotlin's apply with fields. Which one is clearer to you? Alright, going back to my constraints playground here. I have to get the intent that started this activity and extract the message. I'm actually going to do val intent equals intent just to demonstrate that I could make it the same as the Java one. Anyway, I guess the advantage here is that you don't have to say get intent. You can just use intent, which is nice, I guess. So intent in this case is a static call for get intent. Intent.getStringExtra, I called it password info or something. Password info. You'll notice it's called getStringExtra here, and again I didn't have to specify the type on the left hand side because that is an advantage of Kotlin. I'm going to call that password, and then I'll call this secret value and see how do I get an integer instead. Well, see, there's actually a bunch of different things you could get. Booleans, Boolean arrays, bytes. You can send arrays of stuff. You can send arrays of objects. You can send all kinds of different stuff inside of intents. Anything that you would like to send, you can send. In this case, I'm looking for an int, a simple int extra. And that thing has the name of secret value. Secret value. A nice thing that Android Studio does for you is it lights up the field. It tells you that this is going to be a name. That's the name of the intent thing. That's a very convenient feature for me. Create extension function, intent.get int extra. That's not right. Okay, so why doesn't it like my get intent extra? That I actually don't know. I think it needs a default value. Yep, alright, so int needs a default value, string I guess defaults to null. Go figure. Another inconsistency among many. Okay, now I have to find that text view, so I need to import this again, Alt-Enter for the quick fix. I need to find the name of that text box. I called it password field, I want to say. Let's go back and see. Password view, I actually called it. So password field is the edit text from the previous activity. It's the edit text from main activity. If I had tried to use that instead, I would have probably run into an error because it wasn't loaded anymore. And then .apply, I'm going to set the text to password. Okay, so let's run this and see if I can capture that information from one activity to another. Very secret message here. I don't want to show you guys my password, so I typed it without showing you. Let's see if you can see it now. Oh, there it is. My password is hello. Let me navigate back using the back button. I have gestures on this device, so I can change this to something else. Click that, and now I've got that instead. So it reloads the entire activity. When you get to it, it's going to reconstruct it. It's going to run that onCreate again. So if you back out and then you come back to an activity through an intent, it's going to reload the whole thing. This can be an advantage or a disadvantage. Let's say you want a variable to be persistent across the entire program. You want it to be persistent across all of your activities. And you don't want to deal with this weird bundle system where you have to put the keywords and extract them out using different methods. It's kind of odd. So let's say you don't want to deal with that. How do you do it? How do you keep your variables consistent across the entire application? Well, what a lot of people do is they'll make a class that acts as a singleton, and all of the other classes can communicate with it and get their information like that. So you would just make a single class that's a singleton. If you've taken design patterns, you'll be familiar with that. If you haven't, a singleton is basically just a class where only one instance of it ever exists at a time. So you can think of it kind of like a static class. There's just one of them, and all your variables live there, the ones that you need to be global across all activities, and they just sit in that class, and you can refer to that class to extract them. Usually you do that with you need the name of your class.getInstance to return the instance of that class. We'll see a lot of examples of that used across the Android ecosystem. I think we might have even run into one already, but oh yes, intent actually is one of those. If you look at the Java version, you have to do get intent. It just retrieves the intent for this activity that way. And you see that it's static. It even gets the italics in the Kotlin version to indicate that it's static. So very similar there. Anyway, that's one way to do it. The other way, which a lot of developers have started to favor, is not to use activities at all. And rather than using activities, they have one activity where everything takes place. And then in order to move views around and change the way the screen looks, they have the whole display area containing a fragment holder. And a fragment is basically a bunch of UI elements grouped together, kind of like any of these XML layouts. We could have designated this whole thing to be a fragment, basically, and this whole thing to be a fragment. And then when you want to switch between these two different contexts, you just switch which fragment you have on display. That way you live in the same activity through the life cycle of your application, and you don't have to worry about passing variables around in bundles, which can be a little bit janky. So those are approaches that we might look at if there's interest. But most of you are probably going to be content with this approach. Those alternatives have disadvantages. The singleton thing can get confusing pretty quick. You're going to have a ton of variables there pretty quick, probably, and it's going to end up looking kind of like a God class, and that's never a nice thing to have. The fragments approach means that your activity class is huge because it has to handle all your application's UI logic across all the different views that it has available to it, which can be pretty irritating. All right, let me do, I guess, one last thing. I'll print the secret value, log.d, secret value. Kotlin doesn't like the fact that it's not a string. Luckily, there's a toString method on everything, but this is one of those things that I also find pretty annoying about the Kotlin variant. What's wrong with the comma? Mess up some parentheses, yep. Let's see if I can print that out. There it is, it's 5, along with some other stuff, but that's 5. So I was able to pass that secret value as well from this activity, where I set it to 5, over to this one. What happens when an extra that you specified doesn't exist? We looked at that with the int one. Password in diff. It's a different variable here. Let's see what happens when I try to print out a variable for a password that doesn't exist. Type mismatch. String? String. What does that mean? Well, let's see. First, I could say if not equal to null, print it. Otherwise, I can do this. What is that? That's a weird proposal, isn't it? How do I make something a question mark? And what's the purpose of the question mark? Is it, can I do this? What is it talking about here? What does it say? A string question mark. Found required string, found string question mark. So the another advantage to Kotlin, the way it handles null checking is a little bit different from Java. This is something we're going to see a few times. When you want something to be nullable, so it can be null, then you have to give it the little question mark in order to indicate that it can be nullable. So variables with a question mark are a string question mark. Maybe it can be null, maybe it can't be. So something like this, which can be null, and it's detected that by seeing that this isn't there, which is quite clever, by the way. These would have to be string question marks because this value might be null. So we'll run into that more, I guess, next time. It's probably not enough time to get into that today. So for now, I will try to upload all of this to Canvas. Later on, I'm going to connect all this to GitHub instead and let you download from there, because uploading this to Canvas is kind of a pain. For next week, try to play around with putting different things into your intent. See if you can make your own custom object, like I don't know, a doodad, a record, whatever you want to do, and try passing the entire object in an intent. This is something that's kind of frustrating to do sometimes. So make a custom object like a doodad or something. You can obviously make classes that aren't activities by just saying new class, and then try to pass those objects into the intent and do stuff with them rather than just passing strings and integers. Okay, so that's it for today. See you guys next time. Thanks for tuning in.